Hi everyone. Okay. Could someone just put in the chat that they can hear me just to confirm? I think I should be okay anyway. Cool, right. Okay, I'll probably give it a minute or so before I properly start, so a few more people can get here. So anyway, today we'll be mainly going through loops, potentially looking at functions as well. We'll also have a quick recap over what we did last week. So hopefully the stream should be a bit more interactive this time because I've reduced the latency. If anyone does have any issues with buffering at all as a result of that, then just let me know. But yeah, feel free to get your questions in the chat throughout the stream. I'll answer most of them at the end in the last 15 minutes, which is the section for questions and answers. But also feel free to just put them in throughout the session. If they're related to stuff we're doing right now, then I'll probably answer them live as well. Yeah. Okay, I think we will get started. Okay. Right. So as a quick recap of what we did last week, so we were looking at different data types. So if we recall, we have the main ones being strings, integers, floats, and booleans. Those are the main ones we looked at. So if we recall, strings are basically anything enclosed by quotation marks. So they don't just have to be words. It doesn't just have to be like hello world. You can include different characters and numbers as well. So it's just any sort of combination of characters. As long as it's enclosed in quotation marks, then it's a string. Integers, any whole number. So 63, for instance. Floats, a decimal number. So 63.5. And Boolean is either true or false. So when we have a situation when something has two possible values, so for instance, if you're saying like it's a light on or off, you could use a Boolean value for it. It's true or false. It's either true, it's on, or it's false, it's off. So it has two different values. We also looked at variables. So we looked at, specifically as an example, defining integer variables. So like counter equals 0. We have the name of the variable, and then we have the value. And the value could be an explicit value like 0, or it could be an expression. So we could have counter equals 5 times 7. We could even have a second variable, so counter 2, and we could have something involving that. We could have counter equals 5 times counter 2, for instance. And we can also have the same thing with strings as well. We can have a string variable. We looked at concatenating, so basically joining together strings and printing them and all that stuff. So if you recall, to print something we use print, and then in brackets we put what we're printing. We can even print two things joined together. So we could say the value of counter is, and then we would put the value of counter afterwards. And this would join together the first string, the value of counter is, and then the value of counter, which we've converted to a string. because counter is an integer. So we're converting it to a string and then joining these two strings together and then printing it out. That's what's happening here. So yeah, we also looked at if statements as well. So if you recall, we have the word if and then some condition. So it could be like if counter equals 0, if counter is less than 5, and if you remember, they have to be ended with a colon, and then we press enter, and your code editor should automatically indent to show that you're now writing something inside this if statement. Oops. And we can say this: if counter is less than 5, print counter is less than 5. Pretty simple. Okay, and that was the bulk of the stuff we went through last week. If you do want to go over that in more detail, feel free to ask any questions. I'll probably go through that in more depth at the end, because I want to get onto the material on that for this lesson. But also feel free to watch last week's lesson if you want to again, or if you missed it. They're going to be on there permanently on the YouTube channel, so you can always come back to that. Okay, so let's go on to loops then. So we're going to be looking at two different types of loops today. So we have for loops and while loops. So these are the two main types of loops in Python. And we're going to look at when to use each, what they look like, how they work. Okay, so let's look at while loops first. I think these are probably a little bit simpler to understand. So they begin with the while condition, the while loop, the while word, and then they're followed by a condition. So you just replace this condition with whatever your condition is. So it'll be like while, let's say we have the variable counter. Say while counter is less than 10, then we're going to do something. So we're going to say while counter is less than 10, we're going to print counter, and we're going to add 1 to counter every time by doing this. Okay, so what we've just created there is something that prints the values from 0 up to 9. So things to remember with a while loop: you have to define the variable or variables that you're using in the condition beforehand. So it wouldn't work if you'd never said what counter starts at, because on line 9 we're going to basically take the value from counter and we're going to compare it to 10, so it needs to have a value to start with. And then inside the loop we need to have line 11 here, counter equals counter plus 1. Now if I run this, this should hopefully work fine. Yeah, as I said, 0 to 9. I'm going to move my picture because that's in the way. It should be fine. Okay, so as you can see, this works fine. However, if we forgot to add 1 to counter in this loop, we've got an infinite loop here. And the website does not like that. So essentially this while loop, it continues while this condition is true. So it repeats while counter is less than 10. So if we never add 1 to counter, counter will always stay at the value 0. And therefore it will always be less than 10, and the while loop will never finish. And we're just going to have this infinite loop continuing throughout the program. Which is obviously a problem. Okay. Let's look at how we can do the same thing with a for loop. Now, you can get by with just using while loops in Python. There is not really anything you can do with a for loop that you can't do with a while loop. However, for loops are a bit nicer to write sometimes. So a for loop, it can take a few different forms. We're going to be looking at these two forms. And you have for I in range, and then let's say 10. And then also for x in a list. We'll come back to that in a minute because we also need to look at lists. So I think we didn't quite get onto that last lesson, so we will look at that in a moment. Anyway, so let's look at for I in range of 10. So what does this mean? We're basically saying we have a variable called I, and we're iterating 10 times. And iterating basically means repeating. So if we add this in, the advantages of doing this are that it will do the same. Let's just, oh yeah, we haven't defined counter. Let's keep that there. And of course we need to add this in. Oh, right. Yeah, okay, that would help. Okay. Okay, so as you can see here, we're basically changing the value of I automatically without even having to put I equals I plus 1. So we've done the exact same thing as we did before, but we've done it with a little less code. It's a bit shorter, and obviously means it's easier to write for us as well. So generally, if you have a set number of iterations, you know how many times the loop is going to happen. In that scenario, you want to use a for loop, because then you can just say for I in range and then the number of times you want the loop to happen. So in this case, we know we want to print the numbers 0 to 9. So we want it to happen 10 times. So by doing this, I will start at 0, and it will increase by 1 every time. And it will continue while I is in that range. So once I becomes 10, it's no longer less than 10, so it will end. And it will stop printing I. So this is an alternative way, and it's a bit of a nicer way to write this. Okay. Right. Okay. I'm gonna see if I can test your understanding a little bit now. So let's have a slightly different problem. Let's say instead of printing the numbers 0 to 9, we now want to print the numbers, let's say the first 10 multiples of 2. Okay. So in this scenario, let's use a while loop first. Now, we saw that we had to define the variable. So we had to give it a starting value. We then have the while condition. So think about what that condition is going to be, thinking that we're printing the first 10 multiples of 2. And then we are printing a value. I'm also adding to that value. Okay. So obviously we can start with counter equals 0. Now, what could this condition be? So let's say we're printing counter every time. What will this while condition look like? So if anyone wants to contribute, they can put it in the chat. And there's only a couple of you here, so don't worry if you're not sure. So just to give you a hint, think about what the maximum value of counter should be if we're printing the first 10 multiples of 2. Oh, very, very close, yeah. So yeah, you're spot on that you're adding 2 to the counter every time. And your while condition is almost correct. So instead of greater than 20, you want to say while it's less than or equal to 20. So we want to also include 20 as that's the 10th multiple. So we could do while counter is less than or equal to 20. We're going to print counter, and as I say, we're going to add 2 to counter every time. Okay. Now, how could we rewrite this with a for loop? So think about that. You can should be still able to do it in a couple of lines. So if you know, you can put in the chat. Yeah, very, very, very close. So yeah, you're right. I think you're saying print I times 2 there. So that's what you're supposed to do. The for loop. So you still want to have for I in range 10 here if you're multiplying I by 2. So you just for I in range 10 and then print I times 2. Yeah, spot on. So if we run this, hopefully we should see it happening. Yeah, got the same output. Apart from this time, we don't have the last one. So we'd also have to just adjust that. We could adjust it by doing for I in range 11. and that would work fine, because remember that I will start 0 and it will continue until it's 9 with a for loop. That's one really important thing to remember. But yeah, really good. Appreciate the interaction. Okay, right. So I think I've done a fair bit on for loops now then. So I think let's now look at lists, because I said there was another type of for loop that we're going to look at where we're iterating through every item in the list. Right. I'm just going to get rid of all this stuff for a moment. Okay. So let's look at defining a list. So the syntax is very similar to defining a variable. If we recall, we have counter equals 0, for instance. It's very similar. So let's say we have a list of strings, a list of fruits. So we're going to have the name on the left hand side and the value on the right hand side, on the other side of an equals. And then we have these square brackets, and they denote that this is a list. So let's say we have these items. Okay, so just 3 items in the list. Now, if we want to print every item in the list, there's a very simple way of doing that. You can do for x in fruits, print x. And this will basically go through every item in fruits and print. So let's just run this. Hopefully it should work fine. Yep. Banana, apple, pear. Nice and easy. We can also do this with a while loop. So if I just show you as an example. So if we have a counter to iterate through fruits, I'm going to do while counter less than, and this is quite a useful function, less than the length of fruits. So len of fruits basically counts how many items there are in fruits. So it will count 3. So we're saying while counter is less than 3, and then we're going to print fruits counter. And you can see here I've got the variable name, and I've got square brackets, and inside that I've got counter, which is our index we're taking from fruits. So the position in fruits. Now, one thing to bear in mind here is that indexes in lists start at 0, which often catches people out. So index 0 here, so if I was to do, if I comment this out, if I was to print fruits 0, we should see banana being printed. Yeah. So that's the first element. Fruits 1 would be apple, and fruits 2 would be pear. And then if we was try and do fruits 3, it should give me an error. And this is basically saying that the list index is out of range. There is no element in index 3 because index 3 does not exist. Okay. Okay, so things to remember with a list. Now you can have a list of integers, you can have a list of strings, you can have a list of booleans, you can have a list of any data type, but it can only contain the same data type. So you can't, for instance, have a list containing some integers and some strings. You would have to have them all as strings in that case. So just to illustrate what I mean, you could have, So let's say if we had like a list of usernames, and so let's say, yeah, I mean, you probably wouldn't have usernames that are just integers, but just an example. Let's say someone's username was 123 and you had another username that was example. Very boring examples, but you've got two different data types here, example and 123, a string and an integer, and this wouldn't be allowed. So instead, you'd have to convert this integer to a string, and then you'd have them all as one data type. Yeah. Okay. Now you can also add and remove from lists as well. So if we just quickly look at that, if we wanted to add a fruit, we could do fruits.append. Let's say we're adding strawberries. And now if we do for x and fruits, should see strawberries being printed at the end. So it adds to the end of the loop of the list. Okay. And we can also remove an item. So we could remove by specifying what item to remove banana, and we can also remove the first index. So if we see what happens now, we should have strawberries added to the end, banana removed from the start. I think that might be a slightly different function that I was thinking of there. So if we just look at this example here, we have strawberries added to the end, and then we have banana removed as well. I think that might actually be fruits.delete if you're specifying the index there. No, okay. Might have to come back to that. But yeah, so these are sort of the main operations anyway. You've got append, you've got remove, and we know how to now access certain elements, and we know how to iterate over elements. Okay, and this is all sort of the basic stuff we need to know about with lists. Okay, right, we've got a minute until the Q&A part starts. Now, as there's only a few of you here, you might not all have questions. So I will keep going with the lesson as well, because I don't want to just sit here in silence for 15 minutes. But absolutely, if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them, and I'll answer them. I don't mind stopping. So get your questions in about anything we've been through there. Any general Python questions as well, I'm happy to answer. Any questions about the session at all, yeah. But I will just keep going with, I think we'll have a look at functions now, because we said we would do that as well. I'm going to start to bring everything together. Okay. Right, if I just comment everything out. Right. Okay, so far we've sort of just looked at individual lines of code, and you can imagine that over time, if you write a massive block of code, 100 lines of code, it's going to get quite long-winded. So essentially, we use functions to break up our code to make it more readable, and also to reduce the amount of code we're writing. Okay. So let me give you an example. And I think we'll go through some more examples next lesson as well, because we're starting this right at the end. So to define a function in Python, we use def, and then we have the function name. So let's just write it as that for now. And it has these brackets at the end. Now you've seen them before, like with print, with remove, append, because these are all functions themselves. And basically in these brackets, we can specify any parameters at all. Now, parameters are basically values we pass into the function. And this often does confuse people a bit, because what does it mean for it to be passed in? So all we've seen so far is kind of global variables, where we define them outside of any functions. They're available everywhere. So if we're just to define count for a 0 out here, it will be available anywhere, basically. However, if we want to pass a value into the function to be used in there as a local variable, it exists within the function and not outside. We can define it like this. So let's say we're passing counter equals 0, pass counter, and let's say we're passing another variable, counter 2. Okay. This should hopefully become a bit clearer later on. So now we have two variables that we can use in our function, and then we can have some lines of code, do something, and at the end of a function, you will return a value. Now you don't always have to return a value in Python. So some terminology that's useful to know is a procedure and a function, and you'll know it's useful to know that procedures don't return values, but functions do. Now, in Python, you don't specify if something is a procedure or if it's something is a function. You don't have to specify the data type that's returned, but it's useful to know that terminology. So when I refer to a function in Python, it kind of includes both functions and procedures. But if in terms of what a function really means outside of the scope of Python, then it's anything that it's a block of code that returns value pretty much, and it does a certain function, and that's how it gets its name. So what do we mean by return a value? And this can be confusing as well. So like when we pass something in, we're basically taking something out. So if I go through, if I do a proper example this time. So let's say we have a function that's going to multiply something by 2. Or let's say we're just going to say it's going to just multiply a number. So it's going to take in two numbers, num1, num2, and it's going to multiply them together. So taking in num1, num2, we're going to define a variable called answer, and answer equals num1 times num2. And then we're going to return answer. Now, let's look at how we'd actually use this in the program. So we got this function defined. It should work fine. Now we're going to look at calling this function. So calling the function basically means run this function, specify it's going to be run with these parameters, and then we'll get an answer back, which is whatever is returned. So can see here, this essentially does the same thing as saying this, but we're doing it in a function. And this may seem pointless, but if you think about scenarios where you've got really long, large blocks of code with a lot of repeating code, this can significantly shorten it. So I wouldn't recommend doing a function for multiplying things together, but this is just to give you an example of how you would create a function. So it's really useful when you come to the large blocks of code, so bigger than this. Okay, so how to call the function. We have the function name here, and then in brackets we specify what our parameters are going to be. So 5 is going to be num1, 6 is going to be num2, and now we're going to have these passed in. So 5 is going to be there, 6 is going to be there, multiply together, give 30, and then 30 is going to be returned. So now answer here is going to be 30. Now going back to what I was saying about local variables and global variables, answer only exists within this function. It doesn't exist outside. So to basically use the value outside the function, that's why we have to return it. So by returning it, we can then store it in this variable outside that can then be used outside of the function. And we can then print it, we can use it however we want, and we should see that 30 is printed here. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Does anyone have any questions at all they'd like to ask? So I've gone through that fairly quickly there, both loops and functions as well. And functions in particular is something that can be quite confusing at first. It's a bit, it can be confusing exactly why we need them and what we mean by calling a function. So don't worry if you're a bit confused by that. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Okay. Now, you can also call functions multiple times. So this will get a bit, maybe a little bit weird. So you could even go as far as passing in the function as a parameter. Now let's look at how this works. So let's say we want to times together 5, 6, and 10. Now we can't do that with this function. We'd have to create a function that does it with 3 parameters. However, there's a get around. We could actually do this. Do 5 and 6, and then do 10 here. If we see that, we should see 300. So what's happening here is, if we look at the order of what's happening, we're running the multiply by 5, 6 function first. And we do that for anything else. And that might seem weird because we usually read from left to right. But this needs to be evaluated before this function can be run, because we need to know what num1 is. And we can't do that. We can't know until this function has been completed. So we would do this with 5 and 6, return 30, and now 30 would become this parameter here. So 30 would now be num1, 10 would now be num2. We multiply them together, to give 300, and we'd return that and we print it. So similar to before, but just we use the function twice. So this is a useful skill to know. So you could also use other functions as well. If we wanted to evaluate the expression 5 minus 6 times 3, we could create a subtraction function. Okay. So very quickly, what would this subtraction function look like? So we're going to have two parameters. It's up to you what variable names you use and what you call the function, but give it suitable names. And then you're going to have to return the values subtracted from one another. What would that look like? Perfect, yeah, brilliant. Absolutely spot on. So I'll just copy and paste your code. And we can see how this works completely. So go on here, and then, so yeah, answer equals minus 5, 6. And to combine the two, let's say we want to multiply this by 3, as we said there. This can be our first parameter, this can be our second. So multiplied by, and then if we print this out, we should get minus 3. Yeah, perfect. Okay, but we've got a minute or so left. Does anyone have any questions about anything we covered today, or any general Python stuff? So if you do, just put them into the chat. But next week we will have a quick recap over everything we've been through, probably look at some more examples with functions. I think specifically I'd like to take some examples of large blocks of code and thinking how we could shorten them, how we can break them down into functions, because that's a really useful skill. And then also, obviously it's been a lot of theory and me just writing a lot of code. So I'd like to sort of bring it all together in a small project next week as well. So I've got a task we can all have a go at, which should use the skills we've looked at so far. We'll also look at random numbers next week as well, because this task that I'm going to give you will use that as well. Okay. Okay, I assume no one has any questions at all. So yeah, thanks all you for joining again. So we'll be back 5:30 next Friday again, same time. So look forward to seeing you all there. All right.